Have you heard Microsoft's got this new product called Power Pivot? And if a few of you would like to use it, go ahead. No big deal. But anyway, I'm going to present on using Power Pivot to analyze SAP BW data. And let me talk a little bit about the presentation goals. So I'd like to talk a little bit about Managed Self-Service BI. I will probably talk less about Power Pivot than I originally planned. I was not aware that every session except for 3 was going to be on Power Pivot. And the reason I want to talk about Managed Self-Service BI is because we're going to go through 6 scenarios of connecting Power Pivot to SAP BW. And some of them, if you just look at it and say, boy, that's how I want to get my data out of SAP BW, don't make sense. But when you get into the area of kind of self-service BI, they begin to make a little more sense. And we'll hopefully answer the question, why use Power Pivot to analyze SAP BW data? Once we get through with that introductory material, we'll go through 6 SAP BW to Power Pivot scenarios. Just a couple of things. I'm not going to recommend a one-size-fits-all solution. Depending on your particular circumstances, one solution may work better than another. And while I won't talk about other elements of kind of an SAP BW or SAP and data warehousing, business intelligence, total environment, I just want to just make it clear that we're not thinking that Power Pivot's going to be your total environment. This is just one element of an overall strategy. And finally, I have a little bit of allergy, so I hope you'll excuse me if every once in a while I need to take care of that. So I'll do a little bit of introduction. We'll talk about Managed Self-Service BI. We'll go through our scenarios, and then we'll have a conclusion. We can do some questions, and I've got some reference material for you as well. My name is Scott Cameron. I'm a senior BI architect from Hitachi Consulting. I was kind of an accidental BI person. I was in graduate school, and there was a company that had some data that I thought they had some data that I wanted to do a dissertation on. I did an internship for them. They didn't have the data, but they ended up with me as an employee. At that time, we were building access reports on top of an Oracle, I guess it was a staging database or a operational data store. It was data we were sucking out of Lotus Notes, putting in there so we could do reporting. And then the company learned about this thing called star schema, and one of my managers tried to explain that to me, and he just couldn't do it, and we couldn't figure out what this star schema thing was. We learned about BI, so we got Cognos, started building cubes in PowerPlay. Then our company made a partnership with IBM, so we started building cubes in Essbase. As many startups happened, the ship sank. And so I went to work for a company that did Microsoft BI. And I'll tell you, after working with Essbase, you start working with analysis services, and it was so much easier to work with. As you can see, I'm in consulting. We've also done quite a bit of training, had experience in a lot of different industries. Since 2001, I've been mostly working with the Microsoft BI platform. My office is located in Seattle, and we do a lot of work with Microsoft, both with the SQL Server product team and with some of their marketing teams, and we sell to Microsoft as well as sell with them. I've been working with Power Pivot since late March. The material you're seeing today was generated I'm working on a project with Microsoft's SQL Customer Advisory team on doing a white paper on this subject. And that white paper is going to be done, I think it's due May 31st. And we'll get it done before the end of June. And just let me mention, I believe I'll give my email address at the end, or it's real simple, scameron@hitachiconsulting.com. And if you'd like me to send you a link to that white paper when it comes out, just send me an email saying, hey, I want the white paper. Don't bug me about trying to do consulting. I don't want you to sell me anything. Just send me the link for the white paper, and I'll pass that along to you when it comes available. And I'm new to SAP, and boy, has that been an eye-opening experience. You know, I've just gotten my toe wet, and the water is cold. A lot to learn there. But just for, I think a few of my bosses are in here and stuff. Hitachi Consulting does have an SAP team that's very familiar with it, so I've gotten a lot of help from them. So let's talk a little bit about Managed Self-Service BI. So for BI, just kind of an overall technical definition of what BI includes. These are kind of the 4 things that I thought of off the top of my head. We're going to integrate data from multiple sources. We're going to do transformations. We're going to do complex calculations. If I throw a large data set at somebody, I was working with a telecom, and I think we had like 4 to 6 billion records a month, and we were doing 9 to 12 months of data. I want 2 or 3 or 4 second query response out of that, and we were able to do that once we got the aggregations created correctly. And then I want to be able to create insightful, compelling reports and visualizations that when somebody looks at it, they say, oh, that's right. That's what we need to do. So that's what I see as kind of the BI part of this. In terms of the self-service, I want business users to be able to go out and do business intelligence as opposed to having to go into IT department and saying, hey, I need a new report. I just need another column on this one, or change the filter, redo a calculation, and see you in a month. And also with self-service BI, every department's got the guy that's an Excel guru that's taken time to learn some SQL, and that poor person, he's like the guy that owns a pickup truck, right? Everybody's his friend when they need to move. If you need a report, we'll go to the guru in the department. But you've got that power user that shares with everybody else. And that's happening now, right? So we've got tons of Access databases, tons of Excel worksheets, just spread out everywhere. So we've already got our data. Somebody's connected to it. They've put it in an Access or an Excel, or copied a table into the Word doc and sent it out to the world. So the final part of this is Managed Self-Service BI, which is we want something that's more secure than Excel, more secure than Access. And IT wants to have the ability to do some monitoring and analysis so we can figure out, who's authoring reports against what database, who's looking at those reports, how frequently are they being used, what kind of questions are they asking. And that's where Power Pivot comes in, is by allowing users to design and integrate data in Power Pivot, which is part of an Excel workbook, posting that up to SharePoint where they can share it with all the department, and then also IT is able to manage those workbooks and see who's doing the querying and such. We're able to provide that Managed Self-Service BI. I had quite a few slides. Is everybody here seen at least a few presentations on Power Pivot? Anybody not? Okay, I want to go through these pretty quickly then. So you've seen the story of combining from multiple databases, building solutions without code. That's the story. Then there's always this DAX, data analysis expressions. And when I first saw that, I thought, I'm getting comfortable with MDX. I can do some pretty whiz-bang stuff with that. And now here's a new language for me to learn. But DAX is like Excel functions, a little bit more complicated. So hopefully it's more accessible than MDX. And plus, it doesn't really look like SQL, so you don't have the problem of thinking you're working with SQL. Fast query response. It's running an analysis services cube. It's actually product called VertiPack in memory, either on the client machine or if you've posted it out to SharePoint, you can configure your SharePoint farm so that the analysis services instance is sitting on a pretty beefy server. So you could really put a lot of horsepower behind Power Pivot once you start posting things up to SharePoint. And you got the publish and refresh. One thing about the refreshing the data is that the requirements are what that Microsoft built this to is that you can only give Power Pivot a window of time. So you can say, our business operates from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. in the morning to 6 p.m. in the evening. Refresh sometime after 6, get it done before 7. You can't say, this workbook runs at 8, this workbook runs after this ETL job gets refreshed. It's just you give it a window, and sometime during there, SharePoint will decide when to refresh your data. And then as I mentioned, if you're in the Excel, in the Access world, somebody creates that data, they ship it around in, email it around or put it on a file folder, and IT's got no idea what's going on. With pushing your Excel workbooks out to SharePoint, when somebody renders that Excel workbook, when it gets refreshed, all of that gets tracked, and there's reporting that's been enabled on top of that. The one thing that I did want to point out is in terms of the architecture. Let's see if I'm going to get a mouse going here. Is that prior to Power Pivot, Excel could connect pivot tables to SQL Server or to analysis services, other data sources. And it used a data provider, and then it had some kind of external data source. What Microsoft did, the way they architected this, is said, let's just go ahead and continue to use that architecture, except for we're going to have this VertiPack OLAP engine that it's going to connect to. So in terms of how your pivot table or your pivot charts refresh their data, they are going against the data that's in the VertiPack engine. And when you refresh the data in the pivot table, you are not refreshing the Power Pivot data. So you need to be aware, if you want fresh data in your Excel workbook, you have to refresh the Power Pivot data and then refresh your pivot tables. And we'll see that that has some impacts on our scenarios. And similarly, for the Power Pivot for SharePoint, again, you've got the VertiPack engine over here, and when you refresh your Excel workbooks that are in SharePoint, again, they're refreshing against the analysis services instance, and if you want to refresh the data, you've got to, it's another step to refresh the data that's in the VertiPack engine or the analysis services OLAP engine. One other thing to point out is that these APIs allow you to query Power Pivot. They don't allow you any other functionality. So I think one of the big things that people are looking at Power Pivot for is, how do I do an end run around my IT department? Right? And if it's just, some analyst that's creating the Power Pivot workbook and refreshing on his own and then giving it to his buddy, okay. But then you start to get to think about, hey, once we get this created, I want to push it up to SharePoint, and then I want it to refresh once an hour, or one of the things we're looking at is we want to do data dumps into Power Pivot. So, different users are going to want different data, so we're going to want to change the query string in Power Pivot. At the current time, none of that is available. As you know, SharePoint can refresh the data, and SharePoint also has the ability to read the data sources to know where you're going against, but this API has not been exposed. So all you can do in terms of programmatic access to Power Pivot is query it. So why do we use Power Pivot to analyze SAP BW data? Well, SAP BI tools, they're SAP-centric, right? So they've purchased some products, and as they're integrating them into their package and making them more and more SAP-centric and less generic tools. If you're a, say, business objects customer, but you're not an SAP customer, well, SAP's not quite so interested in you as they are people that have the whole package. The SAP BI tools, they're enterprise tools. They're, we're doing big BI. Expensive, difficult to implement. Someone yesterday mentioned, take your people that have Microsoft skills, take what you're paying them, multiply it by 2, and you might be able to get SAP people for that rate. So just costly. Another thing about SAP is it's difficult to integrate SAP and non-SAP data. So we get a lot of questions about how are we going to integrate this stuff? Do we take external data and bring it into SAP BW? Or almost always the answer is pull your SAP data out of SAP or SAP BW and integrate it outside of that environment with external data. The other reason, why to use Power Pivot is just that Power Pivot's going to enable that self-service BI. Someone can go out and grab data from SAP and then integrate their external data. It's really a self-service and a team solution. I'm getting the feeling a lot of people want to use Power Pivot as an enterprise tool. Maybe they'll have some success, but the Microsoft perspective on it right now is, they're thinking about it as self-service and team. They're not really thinking about it as an enterprise solution. So the greatest thing about it, it's free. Excel add-in. Gee, maybe you have to buy Office 2010 to get it, to be able to use it. But other than that, it's free. And it's part of the MSBI infrastructure, right? So it just fits in. If you're working MSBI or SharePoint is making great penetration, then you've got something that easily integrates with that. And of course, your end users have a familiar environment to work with. Okay, so let's go into our 6 scenarios. And the first one we start off with is, I've got SAP BW. Someone has already built an Excel pivot table that's got that data in it. And I look at that and I say, hey, that's great, but I want a little more data. I want some external data. Want to be able to do my own analysis, so I'm going to load it up into Power Pivot. In terms of this self-service, I've begun to think of things as either they're kind of pure self-service BI, it's all about kind of the individual, or you may have some hybrids, or you may have something that's pure, just kind of enterprise BI. I look at this scenario as a pure self-service BI. So if you don't have SAP BW data in Power Pivot or in some other Microsoft BI environment, this is not the way to get your SAP BW data into your BI environment. However, you may already have instances where people have used the SAP BW, SAP OLADB for OLAP connector or provider to load data into a pivot table. It's already out there and somebody just wants to extend their use of it. Or you may have some power users that are able to use pivot tables to connect to SAP BW. So given those circumstances, that might be a way to get this in your SAP data into Power Pivot. So how do you go about and do this? Well, here's just kind of an outline. You create the Excel pivot table. It's connected to SAP BW, or you've already got that. I always want to just jump into Excel and start Power Pivot and connect that to SAP BW using this provider. That won't work. And the reason is that Power Pivot expects a row set, and the Power Pivot expects a row set, and the SAP BW OLEDB provider is returning a cell set. And Power Pivot just doesn't know what to do with that. So launch the wizard in from the Data tab. We're building an Excel pivot table. Connect to BW using that provider. And in terms of getting that installed, just when you do the regular front-end GUI install, there's an option for Business Explorer, and you open that up and make sure you select the provider. And there's a white paper on how to do this, and on the end of my presentation, I give the link for that as well. So this white paper will help walk you through all the potential difficulties you might have. Once you get the SAP data into Excel pivot table, you're going to need to flatten that pivot table out. And the reason is however your data is arranged in the pivot table, that's how Power Pivot is going to read that data in. So if you've got, kind of indented with blanks in the first column where you've got the second column, it's going to read in blanks instead of repeating the higher level parent. So you go ahead and you flatten the Excel pivot table, and then once that data's in an Excel pivot table, getting it into Power Pivot is a just out-of-the-box Power Pivot functionality. And in fact, in all 6 of these scenarios, the last step of getting the data into Power Pivot, all except for one, is just standard Power Pivot functionality. In all of these scenarios, except for one, we're going to have some kind of staging area for the data and then load it into Power Pivot. What that means is that while this white paper and presentation is talking specifically about loading into Power Pivot, these scenarios all get data into your Microsoft BI environment. So once you get it in, you can build analysis services cubes off of it, reporting services cubes off of it, performance point. It's there in the Microsoft environment. So some of the benefits of doing this, why would you want to do it? Well, you extend the use of pivot tables that may already have been created. You do give access to your Power users. If they, it's not too hard to figure out how to get a pivot table into the data into a pivot table and then into Power Pivot. Here's a good way to integrate data, and then finally, it's a way you can transform the SAP BW data and perform complex calculations in Power Pivot. So some of the limitations and pitfalls, as we saw from the architecture, refreshing the data is a 2-step process. You have to get it into the pivot table and then into Power Pivot. This scenario, the SAP BW OLEDB provider is 32-bit only. And when you install the SAP client on a 64-bit machine, you don't even get the option to install this provider. You're getting SAP BW data only. It's not a way to access data straight from SAP. You can't use the Power Pivot Create Link Table feature. And what that is if I've got a table in Excel in that same workbook, I can link a Power Pivot table to it. And then when the Excel table gets refreshed, Power Pivot automatically gets refreshed. That won't work in this scenario because you can't build a Power Pivot table off of a pivot table. And if you want to refresh using SharePoint, you've got to enable the desktop experience feature on your Windows servers. And I've got a good friend that's more of an IT admin than I, and he said this is a big no-no because you end up with, on your Windows server, you end up stuff with like Windows Media Player, a lot of other client features that increase the number of updates you're going to have to run and increase the attack exposure, the surface attack area of the server. And so your IT individuals may be reluctant to allow you to do that. Let's go ahead and do a demo of this. And Let me make sure I've got the right machines going. No, wrong one. Let's try that one. Okay, here we go. So first of all, what you do need to do is you need to go into the SAP login GUI and create an entry that provides the connectivity information to SAP BW. So here's a sandbox instance we have that's full of the IDS data. And so once I've got that information in the SAP login, and we'll be using that information in several of these scenarios, I can go ahead and go into Excel. And I remember I'm creating a pivot table. I'm going to get that from other sources. I'm going to go to the Data Connection Wizard, choose Other Advanced, and then at the bottom of the list, pretty close, will be the SAP BW OLEDB provider. In the data source field, I want to put the description from the SAP login. So that was the description that I provided. I'm going to put my username in. And I'm just going to use simple security for these demos. There are preferred ways to enable security. There is, from the All tab, there's one property that you need to add. And so you go to the extended properties and you need to give the client number. So that's SCF client. And I'm using 800. Once I get that information in, I can go ahead and just click on the drop-down list. And we've missed something here. Yeah, let me check something here. I think this needs to be. Okay. So now it's going out and getting a list of all the objects that it can query from SAP BW. And it does do some jumping around. And I'm just going to go ahead and choose $InfoCube, and in the next step I'll get the opportunity to choose which particular InfoCube I want to connect to. And in each of these scenarios, except for one, I'll be using the same InfoCube. There's nothing particularly special about this one, except for it's the one I've been working with. And unfortunately, it's a little bit a ways down the list. And again, using secure passwords is better than just the simple username password that I'm supplying here. And so now it's going to go ahead and let me create a pivot table. And I'm going to just choose one of the key figures and a couple of attributes. Choose item and posting date. Oops. And of course, each time that I'm doing this, it's requerying the data. I'll put posting date first, just so that we have. You can see that the data is in hierarchical organization instead of being flat. So what I'm going to do is come over to pivot table design. I need to tell it to not show subtotals, so I want all my data at the same granularity. I don't want grand totals either, so I want just the leaf level data. And then in my report layout, I want to show it in tabular form. And here you can see I've got some more than one item on this particular day, so I need to get that filled in. And so I choose repeat all item labels. So now that I've flattened this data out, it's ready to be read into Power Pivot. So I'm going to go ahead and save this file and close it. I'll have to have it closed before I can read it into Power Pivot. I'll start a new file. And now I'm ready to load it into Power Pivot. I start the Power Pivot window. And now we're just using standard Power Pivot functionality in terms of loading data. I choose from other sources. Come down to the bottom, select Excel, browse to the document I just created. I want to go ahead and bring over the column header, so I'll select that field. Click on Next, and it will allow you to select data from whatever sheets you have available. I just had data populated in the first sheet. You can come in here and select the preview and filter. You can check and uncheck columns, so you can filter which columns you bring in, and you can also select column members so that you filter the rows. I'll go ahead and just leave everything in. Click on Finish, and it's going to import that data. And so now I've got this data into Power Pivot, and I'll hand it over to someone else to make it, and they'll make it pretty. Let me go ahead and just save and close this one. So that's how you get data from an Excel pivot table. Our next scenario is using reporting services. And again, in terms of this continuum between self-service and enterprise, I again look at this one as a self-service, pure self-service scenario. Again, not the most efficient way to get SAP BW data into Power Pivot. I wouldn't go out and create a report if I didn't have the reports already. I wouldn't go out and create them just so that I could load them into data into Power Pivot. But if the report's already there, your users are going to want to get at it. The way you implement this, use the SAP BEX Query Designer to enable Query Cube for your query cubes for external access, or you can hit Info Cubes. Reporting Services connects to SAP BW using a provider called SAP NetWeaver Business Intelligence, provider for SAP NetWeaver Business Intelligence. You get that as part of the standard install. So the prior scenario, this scenario, and the scenario that's following are all scenarios where you're just using what you get with SAP and Microsoft BI platform. We don't have to use any third-party tools. You've got the SAP BW data enabled, the provider's installed, then you just want to create a report, or the report already exists using the SAP BW data. Probably the trick of the whole thing is to get this string correct. when you create your data source in reporting services. Then once you've made the connection, you just use the query designer to the same way you would for any other data source to design a report. Again, there's a reference at the end of the presentation to this white paper that walks you through all the steps of how to connect reporting services to SAP BW. In terms of the implementation, again, once it's in reporting services, getting it from reporting services into Power Pivot is just out-of-the-box functionality. And it's a new feature in reporting services. It's really slick. Reporting services creates an Atom feed, which Power Pivot consumes. And I think what's to me very interesting about this is reporting services, that Atom feed, is providing the data set, not the particular item that you see on the report. So if there's a pie chart, you think, how do I import a pie chart into Power Pivot? Well, reporting services is actually providing the data that was used to create that pie chart. There are three ways you can get data from reporting services into Power Pivot. One is from Power Pivot, you select From Report, and then you go to the report server URL. Same way you would, if you wanted to, in Internet Explorer, go out to see your reports, stick that URL in there, and then Power Pivot will allow you to browse the folders in reporting services, find the report you want. If the report has parameters, it'll let you choose those parameters. Then from the report, you select the report parts that you want. It imports the data, each report part, into a separate table. The real slick way to do this is, of course, to browse to the report you want in reporting services. There'll be a little button to start the Atom feed. You click on that, go through the process. It'll actually open up Power Pivot and import the data for you. So the benefits of this scenario, again, we're taking advantage of already existing infrastructure, extending the usefulness of those reports. This second bullet point, it almost leads me to say, hey, let's go create reporting services reports just to get data to people in Power Pivot, because you can create all the reporting services parameters. And so this is a way to kind of create a generic report with lots of parameters. Your users can come in, use the parameters to filter down to the specific data that they want, and then import into Power Pivot. And again, you know, the advantages of integrating external data and adding value to the report. So some of the limitations and pitfalls. Of course, you've got to have SQL Server 2008 R2. The report must be based on an RDL file. So you can't create a report model, build reports off of that, and then import those into Power Pivot. Scalable to about 500,000 records, and this is just kind of a rough estimate. We started importing and got about 200,000 records, taking about 20 minutes or so. Not sure people would want to go beyond that. So let's look at doing this. All right, and I apologize, for some reason Windows Server's not working really well with the video equipment, so we're at 1024 by 768. And let's go. I've got a project already started. So I've just already created a reporting services project, and I've set the folders to where it's going to deploy the report to in SharePoint. But I haven't, and I think I've started a report as well, but I haven't done anything more than that. I haven't created the data sources, etc. Oh, and one other thing I would like to do is I've got that connection string saved in a file, so I'm going to, instead of trying to remember that, I'm going to get that out of the file. So here's my report. I'm going to go ahead and create a data source. And I just need to choose the SAP NetWeaver BI provider. Go ahead and edit this, use the designer to edit the string. I thought getting this correct was the whole trick. You can provide parameters at the end of the URL, or the client and language you can also provide down here. I'm using basic authentication. And again, I can come down and select either a BEX query or info cubes. I'm just going to go ahead and select info cubes, and then later on choose a particular info cube. So I've got the data source created. Now I'm ready to create a data set. I'll use the one that's embedded in the report. And then let's see. Sorry about that. I didn't save. I need to remember to save the password here. There's my data source. And this is going to look just like the designer you would use if you were connecting to analysis services. We'll have a cube browser. I'll go ahead and just select, I want to select the cube that I'm familiar with. Down here in the Fs. Oh, and one thing that I like to do is uncheck this auto execute button. Otherwise, every time you drag an item into the designer, it's going to re-execute the query. So let's just get one of the key figures. Then I'm going to add the same things I did before. We'll add item and posting date. And let's just hope nobody calls me on my cell phone, because it's on. We'll go ahead and click OK there. And it's written MDX that goes up against SAP BW cubes. Click OK. I've got a data set now. I'll just put a simple table out. We'll go add our data to this table. And again, this is all, just very simple to show you how the plumbing works. We'll extend those out a little bit. So now I'm going to verify that I've got this going to the right place. So now I'll just deploy this report, and we'll go look at it in SharePoint. This takes just a minute to get it to deploy. So we'll come out here to our reports page. We'll see there's nothing up our sleeve just yet. You should never tab away from the iDev Studio when it's doing a deployment or something else. It seems like it just slows it down. Please do.
On the previous one, oh, there you go.
There is,
Anyways, on the previous one, you mentioned that to refresh from an Excel file on Power Pivot, you needed to enable that desktop.
so if you push it out to SharePoint and you want to refresh from
Drive
SharePoint.
or somewhere else, and you wouldn't need that desktop experience.
That's right. So if you push your Excel file into SharePoint, then you have to add the desktop experience. If you just leave it into a shared folder, then you're okay. Power Pivot can refresh from it from there. Yeah. Oh, deploy succeeded. Whew. I always feel so good to get some acknowledgement. So let's refresh from here. And we'll just go ahead and view our report to see that it's out there and running. So this is actually hitting our SAP server in Dallas, and so things are a little bit slower than they might be otherwise. You know, when you work with things from Texas, it's a little bit slow. I grew up in Oklahoma, so. So there's our data in reporting services now, and I've got this convenient Atom feed data, button, so I'll just go ahead and click on that. And we'll go ahead and open it. And this is what I really love. It opens Excel for me, saves me that effort. I was having a little bit of problems with my reporting services off of SAP BW, and so I went for as simple as I could. If your reporting services report had like multiple tables and charts in it, you would have the option of getting all of those. As you can see, I've just got the one table. If I had more parts, there'd be more parts listed here, and I could check or uncheck those depending on whether I wanted them or not. Again, I can select preview and filter, and filter both columns and rows. I think I'm going to go ahead and, oh, just as I was ready to cancel. So again, here I can use the filtering of both columns and rows if I'd want. We're all ready to go. And this import will happen pretty quick. He promises. Okay, so now we've got our data into Power Pivot. Yes?
You said you have a problem to scale this alternative because more than half million lines.
Right. So in terms of our scalability, we didn't push it to the point where like it query timed out.
But what we could do is create a snapshot for the reporting services.
Mm-hmm.
The schedule to run nightly and update the Power Pivot in Windows after the run reporting.
Yeah, the only thing is we're not, you know, we haven't had the chance to test if what's taking so long is for the data to go from SAP BW to reporting services, or if it's from reporting services into Power Pivot. So even if you created a snapshot report, it'd be a great test to run. We just haven't had a chance to do that yet, but it may not solve the performance issue. All right, so we got that one to work. Let's look at our next scenario. And this is using OpenHub, additional licensing fees to get OpenHub, and I understand it's relatively expensive. We're going to push the data out to a CSV file and then load that into Power Pivot. This one I kind of think of as a hybrid between enterprise and self-service. And I think this is actually a pretty good model. And the idea here is that your IT department becomes a group that they're your miners or your primary manufacturers. They produce raw materials that they then hand over to your business users, and your business users take those raw materials and turn them into finished goods. In terms of implementation, SAP will let the SAP guys do that. They have to get an OpenHub license. They configure this OpenHub to do a CSV file data export. You can also, from OpenHub, export into a relational database table. Kind of my last comment on this is going to be, don't do this. If you're going to have to do this, do it into a relational database table. But this was the scenario for our white paper. And once you get the export, again, exporting from a text file into Power Pivot is out-of-the-box functionality. So in terms of what's the benefit of this one, you can take advantage, if you've got these exports already happening, you can extend the usefulness of these. Again, we've got this raw materials versus finished product scenario. Power Pivot can import and analyze millions of records. So I think the largest I've done the other day was 28 million. And again, we saw from the keynote speak, it can go much larger than that. And again, we're integrating and transforming SAP BW. So the limitations and pitfalls of this scenario. You got to get the OpenHub license. You got to have the IT resources that know how to do that. Both of those are expensive. Power Pivot exports data from a text file. I think about the only thing worse than getting data out of a text file is getting it out of Excel. So in the text file, all your metadata is going to be lost. It's just characters. Once you import the data into Power Pivot, you're going to have to rename the columns. You're going to have to verify the assigned data types. We did our testing. It was from a test instance of SAP, but one of our columns was just a text field. And there's various options for field delimiters like tildes or pipes. And in the text field, I searched through this file. It was 1.2 million records. Every possible column delimiter had been used in the text files by somebody. They had carriage return line feeds. We had some columns that had null values in them. It was a nightmare to try and import this text file. So if you can avoid, this is like the last resort. I did find one thing useful is in the same folder where you have your text file, you can create a schema.ini file. And within that file, you can name the columns and you can assign data types. So that helps you out. And again, I've got references to that in the appendix of this presentation. Okay, here's all the problems we had with the characters. Again, and it only imports from .text, .csv, and .tab files. Not a big deal. But like when I was given this data with a .pipe or a .dat file, you're not going to, you're going to have to rename those files. In my file, all the data types were of this format. And once I read that into Power Pivot, I couldn't convert that into a data type. I had to use a DAX formula to change it into a data type with slashes, etc. Something that Power Pivot could understand. So the answer to a lot of these problems is instead of exporting to a CSV file, export to a relational database table. And you'll save a lot of problems with metadata. And this one, I'm actually not going to do a demo on it. It's just importing from a text file. It's pretty simple. Yes?
In my opinion, you lost all the security aspects.
That's true.
Raw material,
Yeah.
you lost SAP security, you lost the normal security, it's just in text file.
Right. Right. But if you go into a relational database table, then you're not going to have the SAP security on that relational database table, right? So it can be secured, but it may not be the same as the SAP data. And again, if you have a CSV file or something, you can drop it into a folder and secure that folder for particular individuals. And then again, once it's in Excel, right, it's email to the world. And that's, one of the things about, having managed self-service BI is you can push it up into SharePoint. And again, you're going to have to set the security in SharePoint, but at least you've got something. And again, the security model in SharePoint is they secure documents, not data. And so it's the user sees the whole thing or they don't see it. Yes?
Another thing is you're pointing out that you need the Open Hub license.
Mm-hmm.
In the other scenarios, you might run into this issue as well, because as soon as one non-SAP user get access to your SharePoint where you have your Power Pivot, then you need Open Hub license just because a non-SAP user sees SAP data. That's crazy with SAP, but SAP claims the rights on your data, not only some software. They claim the right on your data.
I'll let your comment stand beyond my understanding of their licensing. So let's look at a couple of three other scenarios. And here's where we're starting to involve third-party vendors. Theobald has an extractor for Power Pivot. They also have components to load data into reporting services, integration services. They've got a .NET component. We'll also look at ERP Link and Simplement. And what's been very interesting to me is these three vendors, totally different ways of getting at the data. Here's just an architecture diagram of what Theobald does. So they've got a server component that connects to SAP, and this is talks to SAP to retrieve your data, and it provides a data feed that Power Pivot can consume. There's also a designer component that talks to SAP just in terms of getting metadata. And again, I think of this as a hybrid solution. So IT will create shared connections. That's basically, here's the connectivity information, and then it can configure the data extracts. It says from this particular cube or BEX query or whatever SAP object, bring in these fields. And then they provide a URL to users. Users can use that URL to extract the data and push it along into however they want to analyze it in Power Pivot. So the implementation, you use the extract for Power Pivot Designer to create this shared connection where you put in all the SAP connectivity information. Then you use the designer to create a data extract that's saying, here's the particular data that I want, and you save the data feed URL. And then once you have that URL, extracting data from a data feed, again, is out-of-the-box Power Pivot functionality. This is the one scenario where we don't stage the data, so it comes out of SAP through the extract for Power Pivot server component and into Power Pivot. In terms of the benefits, so depending on what you want to do, Theobald's providing a series of components, and you may want to, for loading data in Power Pivot, if you've got the other components, you may want to stay in a familiar environment. And then it's very simple in Power Pivot to consume the data feed once it's been created. Kind of the limitations. I installed on a 64-bit OS, and it's using the librfc.dll that the SAP client provides when it's installed, and that's only a 32-bit. So you've got to go out and get a 64-bit of that DLL. Just in terms of some of the things you want to be aware of, you can configure the extract for Power Pivot server. You either have to go in and configure that to start automatically, or there's a console version of the server you could start so you can watch things as they happen. Dates are imported as text. And let me verify that when I was seeing something different last night. And you can rename the columns in Power Pivot. So let's go ahead and demonstrate this. And let me close that. I'll just go ahead and start the extract for Power Pivot client. I need to connect to the server. You get the server address as part of the install. I've connected already. I'm just going to go to the server tab, and I've already created a shared connection. And you can just see that here's the connection, again, with the name from the SAP login and all my SAP connection information. Come back to the main tab, and I want to create a new extract. You can see the various SAP objects that this will consume. I'm going to go ahead and hit the same info cube that we've been hitting before. Give the extract a name. I'll just go ahead and test the connection, make sure we're good here. So it looks like we're good there. Click on OK. Hit the binoculars, and it's got a little filter here that makes it so you don't have to see all of the info cubes. I could choose a query to get from a query cube if I wanted. And I'll just grab the same line item one that I've been working with before. I'll add a key figure. I'll add the same item and posting date that we've been adding before. And I always want to click OK here, but what I want to do now is I'm going to click on this Run. It's going to save this extract. And I'm going to need a URL. I can click this button. It's copied that URL to the clipboard. Click Run in Browser. This is a so you can just test to see if your data feed's working correctly before you move along. So there I can see that my data feed's working correctly, and I've got the rows displayed there. I'm going to go ahead and close this. Click OK there. Start Excel and Power Pivot, and I'll extract the data from a data feed and paste in that URL that I copied from the extract for Power Pivot Designer. Choose from a data feed. Here's where I paste in the URL. So my IT person is going to copy these and give them to my business users. Click on Next. And again, I can do the preview and filter both columns and rows. I'll skip that this time. Click on Finish, and it's imported the data. And that data is available in Power Pivot. Let's go ahead and close that down for our next demo. So our next scenario is using ERP Link inet.bi Data Source View Creator. So this is a diagram of their architecture. There's an inet connection server that's used with other components as well. And then they have a data provider. It's a .NET data provider. And unfortunately, you can't connect Power Pivot to that .NET data provider and just go after the data directly, because Power Pivot is not has not been enabled to consume .NET providers. And then the final element is this Data Source View Creator, and what it will do is it will create an analysis services database, data source view, cubes and dimensions based on the SAP metadata, and then you can consume that from Power Pivot. Again, this is Enterprise Self-Service BI Hybrid. IT is going to be creating these analysis services cubes, and then business users consume the data from those cubes. In terms of the implementation, there's an administration console where you basically enter your SAP connectivity information. You can also configure how many connections are going to be used, and you can have some access control on that. Then you use the inet Data Source View Creator to create your cube. And then finally, the users select data from that cube. The cube by default is going to be rollup, so there's no data actually loaded and stored in the cube. It gets the query from Power Pivot, passes that just pass through to SAP BW or SAP. But you can go in and change the configuration to change those objects to MOLAP objects, and then you could extract the data on a scheduled basis. And when your Power Pivot users hit the cube, they're only querying analysis services. They're not hitting your SAP instances. Benefits is the iNet BI is part of a suite of components that also includes document management and business process components. So if you have these other requirements as well, you may want to choose iNet BI just to stay in the same environment. It's able to handle very large dimensions. They've got a little add-in that if you've got millions of records that are loading into Dimension, it'll break that query up into a series of queries and query ranges instead of trying to grab it all at once. Once you've got Analysis Services Cube, your data is available for all of the Microsoft BI tools. And as I mentioned, you can change the rollup storage to MOLAP. In the Analysis Services DSV, you can integrate data from other tables. And in that Analysis Services database, you can rename objects, you can create calculations, all the things you can do with Analysis Services. Kind of the limitations or things to be aware of. So whoever's working with the DSV creator's got to have permissions to deploy objects to Analysis Services. The install for this one I thought was a little bit too much. I had to get my hands under the covers in terms of had to run a utility, install files into the GAC, modified .NET framework. One thing I will say about all the vendors is if we've been working on this white paper, they've been great. ERP Link walks you through your first install. They've got good documentation on how to do this. I've done it several times now. It's been very easy to do. I found that this last thing in terms of modifying the Power Pivot tables is anytime Power Pivot consumes analysis services data, it creates these great big long names that you may want to go in and modify. Let's see. So let's go ahead and walk through this really quick. So the first thing I want to do is just show you the administration console. So here, this is where you go in and configure connection pools. Oh, I'll do that, because I have seen this many times. Don't need to see it again. So here I've configured a connection pool to our Dallas sandbox, and again, it's all the same information that comes in here. There's a button here to validate. You can set up access control so only particular users can connect to this pool. You can start and stop the iNet connectivity server. Then we'll go ahead and go into that's on my desktop, the iNet data source view creator. And so here what you're going to do is you're going to connect to the iNet, the ERP Link server and analysis services and push from the SAP metadata into analysis services objects. So I'll go ahead and choose the connection pool. Oh, it's already been done here, so that's good. I'll just click OK, and I have to choose connect here. And now while we wait, it's going to go out and it's going to read metadata from SAP and populate these lists of reports queries. So there it's populated my list of objects from, from SAP BW. I'm going to go ahead and connect to the analysis services instance. Oh, I've got a database left out there. I'm going to do a new database. So I'll go ahead and click on test 2, and as soon as I change fields, it's just then it created that database. And these other objects, as soon as I go to the next field, it's going to create those as well. We're all connected up. I'll go get my info cube that I'm familiar with. And I'll expand that one. And I don't have the choice of selecting individual measures, but I can go ahead and grab the dimensions that I want. And let's see if I can find them. There's item and posting date. The choices that I make, I can just go ahead and select apply. I can deselect as well. I click on import, and now it's reading the metadata from SAP BW and creating objects in analysis services. So now I have analysis services database. All the objects are ROLAP, and they contain information based on that metadata. I need to go into Management Studio and process that cube before it can be consumed. Go ahead and connect to analysis services. There's my database. I'll go ahead and process that. Let me start. Oh, and that's really quick because it's just ROLAP, so there's no storage going on. And now I just connect to that from Power Pivot. It's just on the local machine. Choose the database. And of course, now I've got the query designer that's connecting to analysis services. Whoops. Oh, must always forget to do that. Click OK. It's creating the MDX string is going to, it'll take just a moment to get this back into the designer. Then I can go ahead and just finish up the load. E or F tables. Right. Yeah, I found one info. So I initially was working on a sandbox environment that had a lot of junk data in it. I just tried to find an info cube that had some data and loaded it in. So
it's very easy to extract the underlying tables for a cube and just do a table move into a database and you're done.
Okay. Thanks. Okay, and so now we've got our data into Power Pivot. So we've got one last scenario. I must be done. We'll cover this last one quickly. Our last one is Simplement's Data Liberator. And again, a different way of getting at your SAP data. What they do is they enable replication on your SAP transaction database. So you're not using SAP BW at all. And they replicate that into a data mart. And they replicate everything over. You can choose to filter. You don't have to, of course, replicate all the tables or rows. They filter that. They replicate that into physical tables. And then they've written views where they've taken the SAP names and provided friendly names. They've done joins between tables that you would commonly want to join. So they just made a friendly interface here with these views for you to then, you could create reports off of that or integrate it into your dimensional into your data mart. So again, this is a hybrid solution. In terms of the implementation, Simplement will provide you with a virtual machine or an appliance model. They run scripts on your SAP database to enable replication. And then once the data is in SQL Server, getting it from SQL Server into Power Pivot is just out-of-the-box functionality. One of the things that's very interesting about this solution is that it's real-time replication. So you make a change in SAP, and within 3-4 seconds, something like that, by the time you can switch over to query it from your other tools, that data will be moved over. So here's the benefits is you get near real-time replication of the data, also of the security. They've already done some transformations for you, and you can integrate data in your data warehouse. And again, another benefit here is you're getting BI without SAP BW, so you're saving both headaches and licensing costs with there. Some of the limitations and pitfalls, I've talked to just a few SAP admins, and they're a little bit reluctant to enable replication. Although I've seen is they kind of see the story loosen up a little bit about that. There's also concern about accessing the SAP data without using the SAP provided APIs. And this is kind of a pure BI data warehousing solution, so Simplement doesn't provide document management or business process components. However, if what you need is a data warehousing solution, this can quickly get you there. Let me quickly do a demo here. If we can get this open up. Do you think these guys got their heads down, so. Let's see if this one's going to wake up. I'm having a hard time getting this laptop to wake up. Well, if you want to see that, why don't you just come afterwards and we'll find a corner to show that. Let me just quickly wrap up. So the PowerPoint should be available to you, or if you can't get it, send me an email. And I'll update you about when the white paper comes out. There's also papers on the perspective Microsoft has on personal team and enterprise BI. You can get the download, etc. Other white papers that are available, blogs, etc. And here's information on the vendors. All three of them have been very helpful. Seem to have very good solutions. So thank you very much for coming. And somewhere in here, for all of you that need a rock band or a Zune, please complete an evaluation. Thank you very much.